July 18th, 1944, 13:40 hours. Farm Road, 3 miles south of Caen, Normandy. Hauptmann Hans Planck commanded the lead tank in a column of 14 Panzer IVs, moving to reinforce German defensive positions under pressure from British armour. The bocage terrain, dense hedgerows dividing small fields, limited visibility, and forced the column to advance along narrow country roads. Planck's orders were straightforward: reach the defensive line before British forces broke through, engage enemy armour, hold the position. Standard armoured doctrine for the situation. The afternoon was clear, visibility excellent. Planck could hear artillery in the distance, but nothing suggesting immediate threat. His column was moving quickly, taking advantage of the clear weather to cover ground rapidly before the inevitable Allied air patrol forced them to seek cover. German doctrine by mid-1944 emphasized moving during limited windows when Allied air superiority was temporarily absent from specific sectors. The sound reached Planck before he saw the aircraft, a deep mechanical roar unlike the high-altitude drone of bombers or the harsh scream of fighters. This was lower, more visceral, suggesting enormous power being unleashed at ground level. Planck looked up reflexively and saw them. 4 British aircraft diving almost vertically toward his column, approaching at speeds that seemed impossible for their altitude. The aircraft were stubby-winged, thick-bodied, painted in camouflage that should have made them difficult to spot, but somehow appeared starkly visible against the summer sky. They were Hawker Typhoons, and Planck had perhaps 3 seconds to process this information before the rockets came. The lead Typhoon fired 8 rockets in ripple salvo, 60-pound warheads accelerating on rocket motors toward Planck's tank with minimal time for evasion. The rockets struck the Panzer IV ahead of Planck's position, penetrating the top armor and detonating inside the crew compartment. The tank exploded instantly, turret blown clear by secondary detonation of stored ammunition. Smoke and fire obscured the road ahead. The second Typhoon attacked Planck's tank directly. He heard the rocket's distinctive whoosh, felt the impacts through the hull, then nothing. The tank had ceased being a functioning combat vehicle and become an armored coffin containing 5 men who had no time to realize they were dead. The armor that protected them from anti-tank guns couldn't stop rockets designed to penetrate 6 inches of steel plate. The remaining 2 Typhoons attacked the column's rear tanks, trapping the entire unit between destroyed vehicles, burning at front and back of the formation. The Typhoons completed their attack run and climbed away, the entire engagement lasting perhaps 30 seconds from first rocket launch to final impact. 14 tanks had been reduced to burning wrecks by 4 aircraft using weapons that German doctrine had never anticipated infantry support fighters would carry. The few survivors who escaped their tanks before ammunition detonated reported the attack's terrifying efficiency to German headquarters. The report noted specifically that the Typhoons had appeared without warning, attacked with overwhelming firepower, and departed before defensive measures could be organized. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. If German armor couldn't move during daylight without being destroyed within seconds of detection, mobile warfare was impossible. The failed fighter. The Hawker Typhoon's operational history began not with triumph, but with comprehensive failure that nearly resulted in the entire program being cancelled. The aircraft had been designed as high-altitude interceptor to supplement Spitfires, but it proved catastrophically unsuited for this role through combination of design flaws and mechanical problems that killed pilots with disturbing regularity. The Napier Sabre engine, an enormous 24-cylinder monster producing over 2,000 horsepower, was revolutionary in concept but plagued by problems in practice. The engine overheated during sustained operation, requiring constant pilot attention to temperature management. Carbon monoxide leaked from the engine into the cockpit, causing pilots to lose consciousness during flight. The cooling system was inadequate for high-altitude operations, causing power loss at exactly the altitudes where interceptors needed maximum performance. The structural integrity was even worse. Early Typhoons experienced catastrophic failures of the rear fuselage during high-speed maneuvers, with the tail section literally separating from the aircraft. Several pilots died when their aircraft disintegrated during combat, creating justified fear among Typhoon squadrons about whether their machines would survive violent maneuvering. The problem was eventually traced to insufficient structural reinforcement at the fuselage joint, but fixing it required extensive modifications to existing aircraft. The high-altitude performance that had been the Typhoon's design justification proved non-existent. The thick wing optimized for low-altitude operations created excessive drag at high altitude, reducing speed and climb rate. The engine's performance fell off dramatically above 15,000 feet, making the Typhoon slower than the German fighters it was supposed to intercept. As high-altitude interceptor, the Typhoon was comprehensive failure. RAF pilots called it the flying coffin and the tiffy, with mixture of affection and resentment for an aircraft that seemed determined to kill them through mechanical failure rather than enemy action. Some pilots refused to fly Typhoons, requesting transfers to Spitfire squadrons. Accident rates were appalling. More Typhoons were lost to mechanical failures than to enemy action during the type's early service. Cancellation of the entire program was seriously considered in 1942. But the Typhoon possessed one characteristic that would eventually justify its troubled development. At low altitude, it was faster and more powerful than any fighter in service. The thick wing that created problems at high altitude generated excellent lift at low altitude. The troublesome Sabre engine, if kept below 10,000 feet, where it operated reliably, produced power that gave the Typhoon extraordinary speed at treetop level. These characteristics suggested a different role entirely, not interceptor, but ground attack aircraft optimized for destroying ground targets rather than engaging enemy fighters. The transformation. The decision to convert Typhoons from failed interceptors to ground attack fighters required both mechanical modifications and tactical doctrine development. The aircraft's natural characteristics, enormous power, thick armor protection, stable gun platform, suited it for operations that high-altitude interceptors never conducted. Engineers and tacticians worked in parallel to create capability that hadn't existed in the original design specification. The weaponry transformation was dramatic. Typhoons initially carried 4 20mm Hispano cannons, adequate for fighter combat, but devastating against ground targets. Each cannon fired armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds at rate of 600 rounds per minute, delivering destructive power that could shred light vehicles, suppress anti-aircraft positions, and damage tanks' vulnerable rear and top armor. The guns were positioned in the wings, creating convergent fire pattern that concentrated all 4 cannons' output on single target. But the truly revolutionary addition was the RP-3 rocket projectile 3-inch, a 60-pound warhead mounted on simple rocket motor that transformed the Typhoon from heavily armed fighter into flying artillery platform. Each Typhoon carried 8 rockets on underwing rails, giving a single aircraft firepower equivalent to light cruisers' broadside. The rocket's penetration capability exceeded many dedicated anti-tank guns, with 60-pound warheads capable of defeating 6 inches of armor plate through combination of kinetic energy and explosive force. The accuracy was marginal by artillery standards, but revolutionary for air-delivered weapons. Pilots learned to dive at steep angles, 45 degrees or more, releasing rockets at ranges where trajectory calculations became simple and target motion was minimal factor. The rockets fired in ripple salvo, spreading slightly to create pattern that increased hit probability. Even if only one or two rockets struck the target directly, the others would impact close enough to cause damage through blast effect and fragmentation. The Typhoon's structural modifications improved survivability substantially. Armor plating protected the pilot from ground fire, critical for aircraft operating at altitudes where every rifle could potentially damage the aircraft. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, reducing fire risk from bullet strikes. The engine received improved cooling that reduced overheating problems at low altitude where the aircraft actually operated. The tail structure was reinforced to prevent the catastrophic failures that had killed early pilots. Tactical doctrine evolved through combat experience. Typhoon pilots learned to approach targets at extremely low altitude, often below 100 feet, where German anti-aircraft weapons had minimal time to acquire targets. They learned to attack in formations that allowed multiple aircraft to engage single targets simultaneously, overwhelming defensive fire through sheer volume of rockets. They learned which targets were vulnerable to rocket attack and which required cannon strafing. The transformation from interceptor to ground attack aircraft took roughly 18 months from initial experiments to operational doctrine. By D-Day in June 1944, Typhoon squadrons were trained, equipped, and ready to conduct missions that would terrify German armored forces throughout the Normandy campaign. The German encounter. German forces first encountered Typhoon rocket attacks during operations in northern France in early 1944, but the weapon's full impact became apparent during the Normandy campaign, when concentrated Typhoon operations demonstrated the aircraft's capability to effectively destroy armored vehicles through precision rocket attack. The psychological impact was immediate and disproportionate to the actual kill rates. Typhoons attacked with overwhelming violence. 8 rockets arriving simultaneously created visual and auditory effect that suggested larger force than single aircraft. The rockets' distinctive whoosh sound as they accelerated toward targets became acoustic signature that German troops learned to fear. The explosions when rockets struck were devastating, often causing secondary detonations that destroyed vehicles completely. Oberst Heinrich Eberbach commanded a Panzergrenadier division during the Normandy campaign and experienced Typhoon attacks repeatedly. His after-action reports documented the weapon's effectiveness and psychological impact. British rocket-firing aircraft represent grave threat to armored operations. The attacks occur with minimal warning. Aircraft approach at extremely low altitude, making visual or radar detection difficult. The rockets are launched from distances that prevent effective anti-aircraft response. Impact effects are catastrophic. Direct hits penetrate armor of even heavy tanks, causing complete vehicle destruction. Attempted evasive maneuvering provides no protection due to rockets' spread pattern. Eberbach's division lost approximately 40% of its armor to air attack during 3 weeks of operations in Normandy. Not all losses were attributed to Typhoons specifically, but post-battle assessment concluded that rocket-armed aircraft had caused the majority of armor casualties. The psychological effect on surviving crews was significant. Many tankers refused to move during daylight hours, severely limiting German tactical mobility. The bocage terrain that should have provided protection for German armor instead became killing ground for Typhoon attacks. The narrow roads between hedgerows channeled German vehicles into predictable routes that Typhoon pilots learned to patrol. When Typhoons spotted armor moving on these roads, the vehicles had limited maneuver space and couldn't disperse effectively. The hedgerows that blocked sight lines for ground forces were invisible to attacking aircraft, which could observe vehicle movements from above and conduct attacks from angles where hedgerows provided no protection. German anti-aircraft defenses proved inadequate against low-altitude, high-speed targets. The standard Flak 38 and Flak 43 anti-aircraft guns were effective against bombers at medium altitude, but struggled to track Typhoons approaching at 400 miles per hour, barely above treetop level. The time between visual acquisition and Typhoon reaching weapons range was often insufficient for gun crews to train their weapons and fire effectively. Typhoons attacking in formation complicated defense further. Gun crews could engage one aircraft while others attacked unopposed. The Falaise Pocket. The destruction of German forces during the Falaise Pocket encirclement in August 1944 demonstrated Typhoon capabilities at their most devastating. German Army Group B was trapped in rapidly shrinking pocket by Allied ground forces, with single escape route through Falaise Gap. Concentrated Allied air power, including mass Typhoon operations, transformed the retreat into catastrophic rout. The tactical situation was ideal for Typhoon employment. German forces were concentrated in small area with limited road network, making target acquisition simple. The urgency of escaping encirclement forced German commanders to move vehicles during daylight despite air threat. Clear summer weather provided excellent visibility for attacking aircraft. Allied air superiority meant Luftwaffe couldn't interfere with ground attack operations. Typhoon squadrons flew continuous missions throughout the battle, attacking any German vehicles attempting to use the escape routes. The narrow roads became killing grounds littered with destroyed armor, vehicles, and equipment. Pilots described the attacks as shooting gallery conditions, where targets were so numerous that ammunition expenditure was the only limiting factor. Some squadrons flew 6 or 7 missions per day, returning to reload rockets and refuel before launching again. The destruction statistics were remarkable. Estimates suggest that Allied air power destroyed or damaged approximately 300 German tanks and self-propelled guns during the Falaise operations, with Typhoons credited with substantial portion of these kills. Additionally, thousands of trucks, cars, and horse-drawn vehicles were destroyed, effectively eliminating German Army Group B's mobility and logistics capacity. The visual evidence was overwhelming. Reconnaissance photographs showed roads completely blocked by destroyed vehicles, with surviving German forces abandoning equipment and attempting to escape on foot. German survivors' accounts emphasized the psychological horror of the experience. Trapped in pocket with no air cover, under constant attack from aircraft, they couldn't effectively engage, watching vehicles explode around them while knowing that attempting to move meant probable death. The experience shattered unit cohesion and created panic that exceeded the tactical situation's actual hopelessness. Some German units surrendered, rather than continuing attempts to escape through areas where Typhoon attacks were concentrated. General der Panzertruppe Hans Eberbach, commanding German forces attempting to keep the pocket open, wrote after his capture, "British rocket-firing aircraft made organized withdrawal impossible. Any vehicle movement immediately drew attacks that destroyed multiple vehicles. We lost more armor to air attack during the withdrawal than we'd lost to ground combat during the entire preceding campaign. The Typhoon attacks were more demoralizing than ground combat because our troops had no effective response. We could fight enemy tanks, but we couldn't fight aircraft that destroyed our vehicles from above." the flying gas can nickname. Typhoon pilots had complicated relationship with their aircraft, which combined exceptional combat effectiveness with genuine operational dangers that couldn't be ignored. The flying gas can nickname reflected the aircraft's substantial fuel load and the very real fire hazard this created when aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire. The Sabre engine's enormous power consumption required massive fuel capacity, nearly 800 gallons distributed across multiple tanks in the wings and fuselage. This fuel capacity gave the Typhoon excellent range and endurance, but also meant that the aircraft was essentially a flying fuel depot, vulnerable to any weapon that could penetrate the airframe. Despite self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection, hits in certain locations could cause catastrophic fires. Pilot casualties remained significant throughout Typhoon operations, despite the aircraft's heavy armor protection. Low-altitude operations meant constant exposure to ground fire from weapons ranging from rifles to heavy anti-aircraft guns. A single lucky shot could disable the engine, rupture a fuel line, or wound the pilot. Typhoon losses to ground fire during Normandy operations averaged approximately 5% per operational sortie, sustainable for the limited campaign duration but unsustainable for extended operations. The aircraft's visibility from the ground was another vulnerability. The Typhoon was large, loud, and approached at altitudes where visual detection was easy. German troops learned to recognize the aircraft by sound and appearance, giving them precious seconds to take cover or attempt to engage with small arms. Some German units developed doctrine of concentrating all available fire on approaching Typhoons, creating volume of fire that occasionally achieved hits through sheer probability. Yet pilots continued flying the aircraft and praising its capabilities despite genuine dangers. Squadron leader Roland Beaumont, who flew Typhoons operationally throughout the campaign, articulated this contradiction. The Typhoon was dangerous aircraft to fly. The engine was temperamental. The fuel load created fire risk, and low-altitude operations meant constant exposure to ground fire. But the aircraft's combat effectiveness was undeniable. We could destroy targets that other aircraft couldn't engage effectively. The rockets gave us capability to kill tanks and heavy vehicles that previously required dedicated anti-tank aircraft or artillery. The danger was worth the results we achieved. The final assessment. The Hawker Typhoon represented unconventional success, an aircraft that failed at everything it was designed to do, but succeeded brilliantly at role it was adapted to fill. It was dangerous to fly, difficult to maintain, and terrifying to operate at the low altitudes where it was effective. But it destroyed German armor with efficiency that no other Allied aircraft matched during critical periods of the Normandy campaign. Hans Planck's Panzer column, destroyed in 30 seconds by 4 Typhoons near Caen, was one of thousands of similar engagements where concentrated rocket attacks eliminated German armored forces before they could engage Allied ground troops. The cumulative effect of these engagements, the destroyed tanks, the disrupted movements, the shattered morale, contributed substantially to German defeat in Normandy. The flying gas can that pilots feared and German troops learned to dread became one of the war's most effective ground attack aircraft through combination of fortunate characteristics and intelligent adaptation. It wasn't elegant, wasn't safe, and wasn't designed for the role it ultimately filled, but it worked devastatingly well at destroying German armor during period when such capability mattered enormously. The deep mechanical roar that announced Typhoon presence became sound. German tankers feared more than artillery, more than enemy armor, more than any threat they faced during the Normandy campaign, because that sound meant rockets were coming, and when rockets hit, armor became coffin rather than protection. The British had created weapons that deleted panzer divisions not through technological sophistication, but through pragmatic adaptation of troubled aircraft to role where its characteristics became overwhelming advantages. The Typhoon's legacy is its demonstration that failures can become successes if creative thinking identifies alternative applications. The interceptor that nearly killed more British pilots than German aircraft became the ground attack platform that terrified German armored forces and contributed substantially to Allied victory in Normandy. That transformation, from comprehensive failure to devastating success, exemplified British engineering philosophy that prioritized effectiveness over elegance and results over theoretical perfection.